What would happen if you put 5 young men and 6 women who don't know each other on a small raft and sent them floating for 101 days on the Atlantic Ocean? This bizarre experiment is what Mexican anthropologist Santiago Genoves conducted in the 1970s, which he tagged the Akali experiment. What was the outcome of the project? Did they come back alive? Well, grab your popcorn and let's find out. Purpose of the experiment. Many of you who have clicked on this video may be curious about the Raft experiment. Here's what it's all about. A researcher interested in studying human reaction within an enclosed space placed himself and 10 other people on a raft for 101 days as they crossed the Atlantic from Spain to Mexico. At almost 40 feet long, the raft was pretty big. Space wouldn't be a huge issue, and the people's food would all be provided and rationed beforehand. The people in the experiment weren't aware of the purpose of the study, so the researcher kept telling them he was trying to invent world peace. However, the researcher was actually studying the connection between violence and social interaction. He believed that any group of people comprising both men and women, after a certain amount of time alone, would either resort to complete violence or complete harmony. This led the experiment to be infamous in the news as the Essex Raft. So, how did the experiment go? But before we discuss how the experiment went, let's meet the mad scientist behind this strange science experiment. Keep watching. The mad scientist and his inspirations. Let's talk about Santiago Genoves, the mad scientist who organized this event. Santiago immigrated to Mexico from Spain when he was just 15 years old, as a way to escape the Spanish Civil War. It's believed that this experience sparked an intense interest in violence for Santiago, not in the sense of being violent himself, but rather from an academic perspective. As he grew up, Santiago became an anthropologist studying violence in human culture. His endeavors were not without reason. He was inspired by 3 events and circumstances he witnessed and read about. The first was when he worked with another anthropologist, Thor Heyerdahl, who was attempting to demonstrate that Africans could reach the New World around the same time as Columbus. Santiago and Thor constructed reed rafts similar to those available during Columbus's time and floated across the Atlantic Ocean. During this voyage, Santiago began to contemplate the effects of isolation and solitude on people and how it could lead to the release of primal emotions. Whether this led to violent behavior or if Santiago and Thor considered violent actions, I'm not certain, but this was the conclusion Santiago came to. Another event that triggered such imagination in this scientist happened a year later when Santiago was involved in the Southern Airways Flight 49 hijacking in 1972. To give a short version, there was a plane that was taking off and was attacked by a group of hijackers, but it didn't really go anywhere. No one was killed. However, being one of the hostages on the plane thrilled him. He was so excited because I think he was on his way back from a conference where he had just given a talk about violence in history. And then he was taken hostage. This just made him all giddy inside. Furthermore, he was inspired by an experiment that had been done on monkeys in the 70s. In these experiments, it was shown that whenever you throw a bunch of male and female monkeys into a cage and leave them there for a while, the males will eventually begin violently fighting each other and rapidly mingling with the females. Santiago was convinced that humans would do the exact same thing. Hence, his entire purpose with this experiment was to put 6 women and 5 men on a boat. And his plan or idea was that they would become incredibly violent and engage in copious reproduction. He wrote about it in his logs, saying that he wasn't expecting just a few cute romances like at summer camp, where a couple of guys get into fist fights. No, he thought they were going to kill each other, and that everyone would be pregnant by the time they reached Mexico. He envisioned full-blown chaos and trouble on the raft. Santiago wanted to test that hypothesis in humans. He believed that if he could find the reason for violence in the human species, he could uncover the secret to world peace. That was his whole thinking. Let's start with the selection process. How did he recruit his specimens? Keep watching to find out. Selection and preparation of participants. He placed ads in newspapers around the world, asking for volunteers to participate in what he called one of the greatest scientific experiments of the century. The plan was to select 6 women and 4 men for the experiment. I'll explain the reasoning behind those numbers later. The experiment would begin in the Canary Islands, off the coast of Africa, and end in Cozumel, Mexico. It was designed to span the course of 101 days. Santiago never told the participants the purpose of the experiment, even during its execution, because he wanted their reactions to be purely natural. The only information he provided was that the experiment aimed at developing the concept of world peace. Surprisingly, hundreds of people volunteered and wanted to be part of it. As a result, Santiago had his pick of candidates. Santiago selected 6 women and 4 men from diverse backgrounds and countries. However, his primary motivation for choosing attractive individuals in their early 20s to mid-30s was to encourage sexual relations among them. The captain was a Swedish woman, Maria Bjornstam. The only doctor was a woman from Israel. He deliberately assigned women to take up some key tasks because, in the 1970s, women were starting to have a stronger role in society, which he felt would be good for his experiment. This was one of the only admirable aspects of Santiago's experiment. But as you'll later find out, Santiago's commitment to this idea was tenuous at best. All experts' third most important person was a French diver responsible for raft maintenance. Also on board were an attractive priest from Angola by the name of Bernardo, who joined the group out of curiosity, a Japanese photographer, and a woman from the United States who wanted to avoid cruelty in relationships. These completely clueless participants thought, "All right, I'll get on a boat. 100 days off from work sounds good to me." Santiago was so convinced that primal behavior would emerge, leading everyone to go full-on primal at each other. This belief was why he invited Bernardo, the Angolan priest, to join the experiment. Santiago thought that adding a religious figure would create more intrigue, believing that the men would be so on edge and ready to go primal that the presence of a priest would only heighten their frustrations, adding a layer of moral conflict. Santiago was so confident this would happen that he essentially introduced a roadblock to his own experiment, thinking it would add extra spice. Moreover, to the best of Santiago's ability, each participant came from a different background and belief system. The group also had diverse religious backgrounds, political beliefs, and marital statuses. Santiago's goal was to create a microcosm of the world's population. All 10 participants met each other, along with Santiago, the night before they were scheduled to set off. The plan was to start from the African coast, where a tugboat would pull them away from the shore far enough so that the waves could carry them across to Mexico. The next morning, everyone waved for the cameras, said goodbye to their families, boarded the boat, and set off, setting the stage for how this journey would unfold. There is one more thing you should know. This crazy scientist made sure everyone signed a contract. Yes, I mean everyone. Guess what was in the contract? Well, it happened that while they were taking off, Maria, the boat captain, got a radio call from her boyfriend screaming over the radio about whether she had read the details of the contract. He said that it says in the contract that you are to give your body, mind, and soul to Santiago, and he can do whatever he wants with you. Now you know what is in the contract. How did their journey fare? Let's find out. The voyage. Let's start with the conditions on board. Santiago Genovese, the scientist behind this experiment, created a situation where it was practically impossible to be alone. The participants had to attend to their natural necessities on a structure hanging over the water, in full view of everyone else. To add to the discomfort of the trip, there were no books allowed on board. Santiago strictly prohibited reading. The raft, which he named Akali, offered no distractions except for singing songs, telling stories, and engaging in lots of sexual activity. Santiago hoped these activities would occupy the participants. He selected only those he deemed sexually attractive. Meanwhile, Santiago meticulously documented everything they did, filling journals and recording on 40 reels of 16mm film. In their free time, the participants had to communicate with each other and write about their experiences in diaries. Later, journalist Stuart Jeffries from The Guardian noted that Santiago made every effort to create conflicts on board. Before embarking on the Akali experiment, Santiago had spent many years studying the aggression of primates. He expected that very soon, the participants would start to conflict with each other, turning the raft into a place of cruelty and rebellion. He believed that the confined space, lack of privacy, and forced interactions would lead to inevitable aggression. However, Santiago's expectations were not met. The participants communicated peacefully and quickly became friends. This outcome was far from what Santiago had anticipated. He was so fixated on observing aggression that he claimed to see it even when it wasn't there. For instance, one morning, a few of the people were fishing, and someone caught a small shark. They reeled the shark onto the deck, and the group was quite excited. Reading Santiago's journal about this moment, it seems he thought, this was when the violence would come. In his journal, he wrote that they bashed the shark's head with an axe and ripped its flesh apart. However, the video footage of that event only showed the group cutting up the shark and eating dinner. There was nothing violent happening at all. Much to Santiago's chagrin, the good vibes kept going. People on board were just hanging out, hooking up sometimes, and increasingly resenting Santiago. Santiago also distributed weekly questionnaires to the participants. These included questions such as, if you could hook up with someone, who would it be? Have you ever thought about murdering someone? Every week, he handed out these questionnaires, which they all answered privately and then returned to him. Although strange and somewhat creepy, all these were in the name of science. It got progressively more intense. For example, regarding the murder question, it went from, have you ever thought about murdering someone, to, who have you thought about murdering? What weapon would you use? How would you do it? How would you get away with it? These questions were intended to understand their psyche. They were asked every week in the hope of compelling participants to violence or revealing what they thought would drive others to violent behavior. You can imagine it as you're just on a boat vibing with some people, and then someone says, "Hey, have you ever thought about killing your mom?" That was Santiago's social experiment. In response to these bizarre questions and Santiago's increasingly dissatisfied mood, the group began to dislike him. A popular response to "Who do you dislike the most?" was Santiago himself. It became increasingly clear that Santiago wanted his experiment to descend into chaos and violence. He had envisioned the raft breaking down into a mess of aggression so that he could observe it all firsthand. But weeks into the voyage, his hopes were dashed. Instead of chaos, the participants were becoming close friends, enjoying each other's company. Even though people were enjoying themselves, Santiago distanced himself from everyone else. While everyone else was socially interacting, he sat back, isolated, writing in his journal about what social interaction might be like. In his mind, he was waiting for that big moment when they would rip each other's throats out. The videos taken during the experiment showed them smiling, laughing, and playing games together, which was far from the violent breakdown Santiago had anticipated. Now, Santiago also wanted the participants to be intimate with one another. He thought this would create conflict and thus lead to violence. Eventually, Santiago got his wish. Hookups did begin to happen. Few of the men and women slept with each other. They were just bored. There was no emotional resonance or attachment involved, so the sexual encounters weren't really leading to any conflict at all. In total, the experiment went in the exact opposite direction that Santiago wanted. Let's hear from the participants about what they learned while on the voyage. Keep watching. Personal reflections and growth. One of the most touching stories from the experiment came from Faye Seymour, the sole African-American woman on board. She later recounted a profound experience in a documentary, describing how she began to hear voices while sitting on the right side of the raft and looking out at the water. "I heard my ancestors calling me," she said. "They could feel me soaring over their bodies and tragedies." This experience resonated deeply with her, connecting her journey across the Atlantic with the harrowing voyages her ancestors likely endured as slaves. It was a moment of deep reflection and one of the best things that happened to her during the experiment. Another participant shared how the raft became an unexpected escape from an abusive relationship. The support and camaraderie of the people on board helped her through that difficult time, offering a sense of healing she hadn't anticipated. However, while these participants were finding solace and meaningful connections, Santiago Genovese, the originator of the experiment, was growing increasingly frustrated. His manipulations did little to disrupt the growing friendships among the group. So, they were still on the voyage, and news of the experiment began to spread, catching the attention of major newspapers. These publications sensationalized the story, dubbing the raft the SX Raft, and focusing almost entirely on the supposed escapades taking place on board. The negative publicity quickly reached the university that Santiago was affiliated with, and they were not pleased. The university viewed the SX Raft headlines as terrible publicity. They immediately responded by severing all ties with Santiago and his experiment. With his academic reputation in tatters, and his experiment failing to produce the results he wanted, Santiago found himself more miserable and isolated than ever. The crew faced some challenges, but not as Santiago thought. What were those challenges, and how did it affect their relationship? Let's find out. Challenges and key incidents. As the voyage continued, the travelers faced various challenges with the equipment. The ship leaked twice, the compass broke, and radio communication failed several times. They were left without contact for weeks. One notable confrontation on the ship was between Maria and Santiago. A tropical storm was approaching as they drifted into the Caribbean. Santiago had appointed Maria as the captain of the raft. It was her job to lead them through treacherous times and keep the raft moving in the right direction. She decided that they should take shelter on a nearby Caribbean island. This decision would have meant the end of the experiment. Santiago argued that contact with civilization would derail his study. However, Maria refused to risk everyone's lives for Santiago's seemingly failed experiment. Santiago could not allow this, and took command himself. He removed Maria from her duties as captain and made himself the captain instead. Santiago ordered everyone inside the cabin, locked the doors, and had them wait out the storm. The crew, realizing that the main danger was coming from Santiago, began to think about physically eliminating him. Fortunately, it did not come to that as the storm turned. The raft experienced only some rain and wind. Shortly after, another challenge arose when the raft's rudder broke. Santiago had hired women for the most important jobs on the raft. One such woman was Servani Zanotti, the raft's diver. She was qualified, willing, and able to dive under the vessel to fix the rudder. However, Santiago did not let her. He said she couldn't go overboard because she was a woman, which was strange considering he had hired her as the diver because she was a woman. Servain was understandably angry, but relented. Santiago took her diving gear, which did not fit him, and went into the water. He had no idea how to use Servain's gear or mask, and had no clue how to dive. Santiago completely failed, almost drowned, and came back aboard with the rudder still broken. That night, while Santiago was asleep, Servane dove under the boat and fixed the rudder herself. The next morning, Santiago found out and was furious. This incident was essentially the straw that broke the camel's back. Santiago began to manipulate his so-called experiment blatantly. He called a meeting and told everyone they were too friendly with each other. He admonished them for not taking the experiment seriously. Santiago started reading the responses to their deeply personal questionnaires out loud. For example, he would tell one person that another wanted to kill them, or that a third person wanted to have sex with them. This was a gross and bizarre attempt to turn the subjects against each other. At one point, Santiago called the sole black woman on board primitive and said she should sleep with the black man on the raft because it was natural. Fate intervened to change the situation. One early morning, while everyone was asleep, someone noticed a huge cargo ship approaching the raft. The collision seemed inevitable. Santiago, now the captain, panicked and ran around the raft screaming, with no idea what to do. Maria, the former captain, remained calm. She gave everyone instructions on how to signal the freighter to change course. Maria had them fire flares, wave signals, and sound the raft's horn. At the last minute, the freighter changed course and avoided the raft. From then on, Maria was rightfully the captain again, and her leadership was no longer questioned. After that incident, Santiago withdrew entirely from the experiment. He stopped giving out questionnaires, stopped taking notes, and stopped holding meetings. Instead, he sulked by himself. Santiago stopped testing, and, whether genuinely or psychosomatically, fell ill. Santiago sat in the cabin all day and all night, being tended to. The participant, who was the medic, later agreed that Santiago was probably faking illness for attention. With Santiago basically eliminated from the picture, things on the raft improved. The group was free to have fun and enjoy themselves without Santiago constantly lurking. Participants said that after Santiago withdrew, their casual friendships turned into genuine, intimate bonds. Did they eventually arrive on shore safely after Santiago almost got them all killed on board? Let's find out. Conclusion of the experiment. Sure enough, by the time August arrived, they made landfall in Mexico, and after 101 days, the raft experiment was over. They had become so close by this point that they talked about how sad they were that they wouldn't get to see their friends for a while. One participant even said, "I could have stayed on that cruise forever, but I had to go home and see my kids and do all of that. But I hope in the future I get to see these people again." The raft was towed to safety on August 20th, 1973. According to the experiment results, no clear scientific conclusions were drawn. It is not surprising that Santiago Genovese was dissatisfied. The team remained united, despite all the difficulties and the scientists' provocations. The group grew closer together and formed a sort of support system. Santiago's experiment was anything but scientific, and despite his blatant manipulations and constant antagonizing, he never got the violence he so desperately wanted. Instead, he unintentionally created a group of lifelong friends. The only person to whom everyone harbored persistent hostility was the author of the project. Years later, what did the crew and the media have to say about those moments? And what mark did it leave on the world of history? Let's find out. Aftermath. Many years after Genovese's death, journalists reunited the Sex Plot team. A documentary was filmed about the difficult journey in which the former participants shared their impressions. To awaken their memories, a pavilion resembling their ship was built for the film. Interviews with the eyewitnesses were supplemented by footage shot on board with a 16mm film camera. The film, titled Sex Plot, was both interesting and thought-provoking. What's really funny is that in the documentary, when Maria returns after 50 years, she says, "Yeah, I still can't stand the man. I know he's dead, but I hate him." As further proof of how strange Santiago was, another thing he did in addition to the questionnaires was to make everyone draw a picture of a tree every week. There's this theory in psychology that the way someone draws the roots and branches can reveal aspects of their mental health. He had all of them draw these trees. And Maria, who harbored incredible hatred towards him, threw her drawing in his face. In his journal, Santiago wrote, "Ah, from the detail of the branches, I can tell she is rather upset." It wasn't directed at other people. No one liked Santiago, which is a significant testament to how disconnected he was from everyone else. As for the others, they continued life as if nothing had happened. Sirvain mentioned that when she left her job to start the journey, her boss said, "Well, when you get back, that's going to be a life-changing experience being at sea for 100 days. When you return, you'll probably want a bigger or better job or whatever." But she said that when she got back, literally nothing had changed. That was kind of the consensus from everyone. They made friends and worked through personal issues, but it wasn't as if they came back thinking of themselves as more animalistic. They were like, "Yeah, I had a good little vacation. Made some new friends, you know how it goes." If you were to meet Santiago in person, what would you tell him or ask him? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to get notified when we drop entertaining and informative content. Thank you for watching, and be sure to check out our other videos.